You just made the biggest mistake of your life." His voice was low, dangerous. I didn't flinch. That was letting you in. The moment sirens blared in the distance, his bravado cracked. He lunged toward the door like he had an escape plan, but it was too late. My 36M was just chilling on a random Tuesday night when my wife came up to me looking stressed out. She started twisting her wedding ring around, which she always does when she's anxious. I asked her what was going on, and she hesitated for a second before saying, "Listen, there's an old friend from high school who needs a place to crash. Can we let him stay here for a few weeks?" Thing is, I've literally never heard of this friend before. We've been married 6 years, and she usually tells me stories about people she used to hang out with. This dude's name never came up, so I was a little suspicious. I asked why can't he stay with his own family or maybe rent a cheap motel. She said he'd been traveling overseas, had nowhere to go, and needed someplace steady to land while he job hunted. She was practically begging me to say yes. I could see she felt guilty about something. Maybe they'd had some fallout back in high school, and she wanted to make it up to him. Whatever it was, I didn't want to be the jerk who shut the door in her friend's face, so I said fine, he can stay but only for a bit. Deep down something felt weird. But I shrugged it off thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. A couple days later the friend shows up on our doorstep with a backpack and this smug look on his face. He wasn't rude at first, he smiled, thanked us, and said he appreciated the help. I led him to the guest room, showed him the basics, and thought we'd just roll with it. But within hours, he was super touchy-feely with my wife, laughing way too hard at her jokes, hugging her a bit too long. She brushed it off as normal. But it set off alarm bells in my head. The next day, I pulled her aside and told her I was uncomfortable. She said he's just affectionate. It's not a big deal. I wasn't convinced, but I let it go for the moment. Then I got a call from my mother, who lives about an hour away. She said she heard through my father, who heard it from an old co-worker, that this friend had some kind of shady reputation. She wasn't sure of the details but told me to be careful. When I brought that up to my wife, she got defensive, telling me not to listen to gossip. Over the next few days the friend started acting more like he owned the place than a guest. He'd leave dirty dishes in the sink, clothes lying around, and he didn't offer any money for groceries or anything. My wife kept saying he's just trying to get back on his feet, don't give him a hard time. But it was getting annoying. He also snooped around a lot. One evening I came home from work and found him rummaging through our kitchen drawers. He claimed he was looking for snacks, but it felt like he was searching for something else. Not only that, my wife got a bit secretive with her phone. I catch her reading text, then she'd turn away like she didn't want me to see. That was new. She never used to hide stuff like that. I started wondering if something was going on between them. I hated feeling like a paranoid idiot. But my gut was telling me I should pay attention. A few days later we threw a small birthday party for my sister. My parents came, plus my wife's parents and a few of our friends. My sister is pretty blunt, and she pulled me aside right away, whispering, "That friend of your wife gives me the creeps. He keeps staring at me and asking weird questions." Then during the party, he started telling these embarrassing high school stories about my wife, stuff I'd never heard before, like how they snuck out at night, partied together, and almost got in trouble. He made it sound like there was a lot more history than just, we took some classes together. People in the room looked uncomfortable, and my father ended up cornering me in the kitchen, saying he recognized the friend's face from a co-worker's warning. He told me again, "Be cautious, son. I've heard this guy's name come up in some bad stories." At this point it felt like everywhere I turned, someone had a story or a hint that this friend was a problem. My wife, however, was weirdly protective of him. She insisted we give him space and not believe baseless rumors. I was torn between trusting my wife's judgment and trusting my own gut. Eventually I decided I needed some real proof. I confided in one of my closest buddies, who suggested we do a proper background check. He put me in touch with a private investigator he knew. I had a twinge of guilt because it felt like I was going behind my wife's back, but the guy was living under our roof. I needed to know who I was dealing with, so I gave the PI all the info I had and name, rough age, where he claimed he'd been. Then I waited while the tension in my house kept building. He was still there, still acting like he ran the show, and my wife was still caught between us. She even admitted she'd loaned him some money for expenses, which really ticked me off. When the PI finally called me back, the news was way worse than I expected. The friend apparently had a history of running scams, identity theft, forging documents, assault charges, and another state. Who even knows how many of the charges actually stuck? But the rumors alone were enough to freak me out. He used slight variations of his name to dodge detection. The PI didn't have every single detail, but it was enough to confirm he was bad news. I was pissed. I confronted my wife, but she still didn't want to believe he was dangerous. She said maybe he'd messed up in the past, but insisted he was turning over a new leaf. We ended up in a huge fight about it. I tried to explain that this wasn't just a bad past, he had an active record, and who knew what he might pull. She said she needed more proof, and that I was overreacting. The next morning I woke up to the sound of them arguing in the living room. He was yelling at her that he knew I'd been poking around in his life. She shot back that he had no right to go through her phone, which he'd apparently just tried to do. I walked in, and they both glared at me like I caused the problem. He turned to me and said, "You think you're real smart digging into my personal business? Huh? This is going to end badly for you." That was a serious threat, and it made my blood run cold. My wife just looked at me in a panic, not sure whose side to take. He stormed off, and I realized this was turning into a bigger danger than I thought. I called my father's retired officer friend for advice. He told me if I felt threatened I should reach out to the police immediately, or at least get a restraining order. But he also warned me that I'd need tangible evidence of threats or illegal activity. I remembered hearing from my mother again. She'd called me with a heads up that someone in their circle recognized this guy as a known scammer in a neighboring state. It all lined up. This was no coincidence. Then came the final straw. My wife and the friend went grocery shopping together, and I took the chance to snoop through his stuff in the guest room. Look, I know that's not the nicest thing, but he'd already crossed a bunch of lines. I opened a drawer and found a fake ID with a different variation of his name, plus a bunch of receipts for random hotels under different aliases and scribbled notes with phone numbers and amounts of cash. It was definitely sketchy. There was no way I could just chalk this up to misunderstood guy with a rough past. They got home, and I immediately grabbed my wife, showed her the fake ID, and said, "Look at this. Explain to me how this is normal." She just stared at it, stunned. Then the friend snatched it out of my hand, telling my wife, "Don't listen to him. I told you I've had some complicated stuff happen." She started pressing him, but he got nasty fast, basically telling her to back off. That's when I said, "You're leaving or I'm calling the cops." He gave me this sneer and refused. He started ranting about how we owed him for letting him stay, like he was entitled to keep living in our house. My wife was standing there, torn between disbelief and fear. At that moment I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and told the dispatcher we had an unwanted house guest who was threatening us. They sent an officer right away. When the cops showed up they separated us to get the story straight. He tried to charm them, acting like it was just a personal dispute, but I handed over the fake ID and the other documents I'd found. One officer asked him point blank if he had any outstanding warrants. He lied and said no. But once they ran his information, they found out there were indeed ongoing investigations about fraud in another state. They cuffed him in our driveway, and I watched the smug look drain off his face. He started cussing us out, calling us traitors, saying we set him up. The cops weren't having it. They put him in the patrol car and drove away. My wife and I were left standing in the living room, both in shock. It took a moment to sink in that we basically had a con artist living under our roof. We gave statements at the station, explained everything, handed over every piece of evidence we had. The officers said we did the right thing, better to call them than risk things getting violent. I felt this huge wave of relief once he was gone, but the house still felt tense. My wife started crying, realizing she'd defended a total creep. She kept apologizing, saying she felt horrible for not believing me sooner. We had a bunch of serious talks about trust, about how she'd let guilt over their old friendship blind her to all those red flags. She admitted she was worried about him being on the street, and thought she owed him a second chance, but obviously that was a mistake. Our families were all relieved. My father just said, "At least it's done now," and my mother felt vindicated for warning me in the first place. My sister was like, "Holy crap, that was intense." We changed the locks, upgraded our security system, and I filed a restraining order just to cover all bases. We didn't know if he'd try to come back after he posted bail or anything like that. Luckily we haven't heard from him since, except for a call from an investigator asking for more details about our experience. I'll be real, the whole thing messed with my head. One week my life was normal, just me and my wife, our cozy house. The next, I'm dealing with background checks, threatening confrontations, and the cops carting a guy off from my front yard. It rattled me, but if anything, it taught me to trust my instincts. If someone's throwing up red flags left and right, I shouldn't ignore it. My wife and I also realized we have to communicate better. If she's going to bring someone into our home, we both need to be on the same page before that person even walks through the door. And let's be honest, the moment he got hauled away in cuffs, I felt a huge sense of satisfaction. He tried to manipulate us, threaten us, and act like we owed him. Instead, he ended up in the back of a patrol car. That was the ultimate payback, knowing he'd have to face whatever legal consequences were waiting for him. My father's retired officer friend was happy we handled it the legal way, instead of letting it turn into some ugly fight. We're still sorting out the emotional aftermath. My wife is embarrassed she fell for his sob story, and it definitely caused some strain on our relationship at first. But we're working through it. What matters is that he's gone, we're safe, and we learned a valuable lesson about not blindly trusting every sob story that walks through the door. So yeah, that's the crazy saga. If you ever have an old acquaintance pop back into your life out of nowhere, especially claiming they're broke and desperate, do yourself a favor and ask some questions. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for helping people, but I'll never ignore my gut again if something feels off. I'm just grateful we caught on when we did. And that the police took it seriously. It could have been so much worse if we let him keep doing his shady moves. Now, at least he has to answer for everything he tried to hide. Anyway, that's my story. My wife's old friend ended up being a total scammer with a fake identity, and I basically had to force him out of our home by calling the cops on him. Our house finally feels normal again. And I'm hoping we can just move forward and not have to worry about con artists showing up on our doorstep ever again. Live and learn, right?